Hello, my guest today is Guy Mason, an experienced transformation leader who has worked across many industries and countries. Our conversation explores many things, including the importance of culture on transformation and the nuances seen within PE-backed businesses. Let's get on with the show and say hello to Guy now.
Hi.
Well, welcome to the Transformation Leaders Podcast, Guy. Thanks for agreeing to join me today. It would be great if you would introduce yourself, letting the audience know more about your background and your career to date, and ultimately how you got involved in change and transformation in the first place.
Thank you, Tony. It's really a pleasure to be here. Background is one of these interesting things, isn't it? You can spend an hour talking about it or 2 minutes. I'll try and do the 2 or 3 minute version because that's clearly more acceptable. I'm actually a mechanical engineer, which gets frowns in the IT community, even bigger frowns in the HR community, because engineers have no feelings. So what I've tried to do throughout my career is mitigate for that. But nevertheless, I think the structure and logic that comes with engineering is a great help in most walks of life, and particularly in transformation. But I'm sure we'll cover that later in the conversation. So my background is, I graduated in mechanical engineering. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, which is probably more common than people will admit. I mean, I got invited back to my daughter's school to give a talk on managing your career, and I found myself standing up and saying I had no idea what I wanted to do when I left university, and so I kind of fell into a few jobs. But I did a mistake in the first year and a half of working. I went into financial services thinking that's where the money was and that's what would make me happy. In practice, it didn't. So I then went off and did engineering for one of the big oil companies, ExxonMobil, and found myself working on big change projects where you strip an entire refinery to the nuts and bolts, clean it, put it back together again. And that was really very, very early on my first taste of change. It was complex change, it was practical change, but nevertheless, it was change. And in doing that, I worked alongside some consultants, actually from PwC, and I thought I was better than them, so I went off and joined them as a consultant and found myself having done a lot of technology and change using things like SAP implementations. I found myself joining as a management consultant, thinking I had a real skill in things like predictive engineering failures, that kind of stuff. And I found myself immediately put into the education part of the PwC capability. I think those are the days when anyone almost passing the front door got sprayed as a consultant and shoved out at an enormous billing rate. So again, that's a little unfair, but I learned a huge amount from PwC, not just about how you do things, and that includes change, but how you engage with clients. What do you do about managing the people aspects? And I think that's paid back enormously through the rest of my career. I did more and more in technology. I left PwC to become the global CIO for an industrial services business owned by GKN, which more or less doesn't exist anymore. And then I went on to do other big CIO jobs. So DB Schenker Rail, the German state railways freight division, TNT Express. So that was in Frankfurt, TNT Express in Amsterdam, running the technology globally for them. I then had a slight career misstep. I thought I wanted to run a systems integrator, and I ran the European end of a relatively small 20,000 people Indian outsourcer, and found that wasn't me. Selling bodies just that bit cheaper than somebody else really wasn't as motivating as I thought it would be. So I set up my own consultancy, and we've developed a capability in delivering support to private equity. And by that, I mean the change process that private equity goes through with their portfolio companies. So from pre-acquisition due diligence through the value creation component, and then the reverse due diligence on sales, so that the PE fund providers get their turn by selling expensively and buying cheaply. And frankly, the PE value creation process is just one big transformation process for those companies they employ. I also did a number of CIO interims, so Clark Shoes, Bourne Leisure, which is the super brands of Butlins, Haven, and Warner Hotels, and what a brilliant company that is. And I learned an awful lot working there. And I'm now back doing management consultancy, both on an interim basis, but also taking the bones of what we built in the previous consultancy to support private equity, we've just formed an Anglo-American consultancy where we are, again, refocusing on private equity, but using a fairly clever platform to bring efficiency to the overall process. So one way or another, I think I've been involved in change, whether it's mechanical, very specific, very definable change in the oil industry, through to retail, hospitality, leisure, where there's a much more human component to the change process we go through. The one thread that's run through all of it for me has been technology. And whilst I wouldn't consider myself a deep technologist, I recognise that technology can both be an objective of change and a facilitator of change. And I think getting the balance between those things, well, it is a challenge, but it's also important for what we want to do.
Brilliant. Well,
so that's my background.
No, an amazing background and lots to delve into there as we go through the episode. So thank you for that. How do you define transformation, given that, and given that you've done so much in the field of sort of change and transformation? How would you define transformation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I suppose if I'd done enough prep, I'd have asked ChatGPT or something what transformation is, and it would probably give me a perfectly accurate but very boring answer. I think the way I describe it is to distinguish transformation from change, and I think the two are different things. So for me, change is generally a sort of single dimension thing. It's a new system or a new organization structure or a new strategy, and typically it's deliverable in a logical, structured, even a mechanical way. For me, transformation is a multi-dimensional change. So it covers things like process, technology, people, direction, strategy, and probably most importantly, culture. And I think that what we need to do is recognize that, yeah, it covers the ingredients of change that I talked about before, but it needs more. It's not just moving from state A to state B. It's a change in mindset, approach, and culture that means continuous change then is possible, and you don't just move the organization from A to B, but you put the organization on a journey where it can continue to change. I know that's a relatively woolly answer, and it would be easy to say, oh, it's all about depth, it's all about complexity. It's far more than that. And I think if we come to talk about what are the components that you need to get right for change, I think the difference between the two becomes much more apparent.
Good. Yeah, I agree. And I think that concept of it consisting of lots of moving parts that you're actually trying to pull together in a structured way to drive the organisation from A to B, but as you say, incorporating lots of different projects in different initiatives in different areas of focus so that you get to that end point is a common theme that comes in terms of the answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think we're all guilty of using language softly, and the word transformation is probably overused or inappropriately used quite a lot today. I've got a client that's saying it's doing a cloud transformation project. Essentially, what it's doing is taking systems out of its data center and putting them in the cloud. That's not transformation. That's a change program in IT. But it helps with stakeholders to label it transformational, which it might allow other changes then to occur which are transformational, but it of itself is not the case.
No, it's interesting. I wrote a LinkedIn post a few months ago, and it was very much around that subject area, that there's so many of these digital transformations that are being talked about that are nothing more than a system implementation. A few years, we would have just called them a system implementation, but can be quite complex and does require change, but actually, as you say, one-dimensional. And I think that's the difference between projects and programs and just ongoing change and transformation. It's much more than a one-dimensional aspect. So you touched on it earlier, and I wanted just to explore it a little bit further. The work that you're doing in the consultancy at the moment with the private equity side, and you talk about really being able to drive value creation within sort of privately owned businesses, but when they are PE backed or when they're being approached or when they're entering that sort of process of being PE backed. Can you just explain a little bit more about your approach there and what you do to drive that value? Because I would argue that probably a lot of the stuff that you're doing is relevant to organisations of all sizes. So it'd be really interesting just to explore that a little bit further.
Yeah, so when I first started working with private equity, which was in 2017, we went through an exercise that, with hindsight, was particularly naive. We decided that there was a ripe market for mid-sized portfolio companies where they're probably too small for the McKinsey or the Deloitte to get out of bed to deal with, but they're too big for the sort of assembling a group of individual one-man band consultants. And we thought that there was a market that was underserved. And in fact, as it turns out, and we discussed with 2 or 3 private equity companies, they always moaned that they've got the B team for those kind of assignments from a Deloitte or an Accenture or otherwise. And so our focus was, can we describe the process through which value is created in a way that we can, I'll use the word automate, but it's a little bit more than that. If we could automate that, or at least codify it so that the activity you go through is really clear and really efficient. And the way we felt we would add value and quality was to reduce the time spent on mechanical tasks that aren't value adding, and increase the time, because all time is billable, increase the time on those things that add real value. So we spent a bit of time with a couple of private equity firms saying, what is the value creation process that you go through? And interestingly, all the PE firms we've spoken to and subsequently done assignments for, they have a slightly different language, but essentially the process is the same for all of them. I have to be careful, I'm not going to name any, but it is fairly incestuous. People move from fund to fund. Essentially there's a single process. And it's sort of 5 steps. And there's a set of activities that go on before the PE firm buys a company. Much prior, there's a sort of scan of, if we want to buy something in the widget manufacturing sector, because we think we can unlock value there, what companies are there and are they right for purchase, etc. But after that, there's a pre-acquisition due diligence phase where you look at the specific target company and say, against a range of measures, how effective is it? Where is it falling short of what it could be? And therefore, how would that unlock value? And particularly if the PE firm has a view for how the market might be disrupted, how ready is this company for being part of that disruption? So that's pre-acquisition due diligence. There's typically a phase after that, which is having bought the thing and actually got the keys to it. Is what we've owned, what we thought we were buying, and where are the fires that need to be fought? And some of those are, compliance fires like cyber security or no HR practices or poor contracting. You then go into an exercise around what is the business plan that would deliver the disruption and the value, and then what are the components of the functions within the company that would need to unlock those. And we focus more on the technology function than we do on other things, but the same is true of legal, people management, finance management, operations, customer service, all those kind of things. And so there's an exercise that says, this is what we think the North Star is as far as making this a disruptive, high-value business. And here's what we need to do in each of these functional areas to deliver them. The challenge is to be able to look across all the functional areas holistically rather than just in silos, but I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussions. So it's about setting the North Star, and then what is it that you need to do in order to deliver that. Stage 3 is essentially to make all those changes. And I know that sounds very simple to say, but clearly it takes on. But the other thing, of course, if the PE firm's going to hold the portfolio company for, say, 5 years, it needs to get all the change done in years 1 to 3. So it has 2 clear years at the end of low cost, high returns, and that ups the valuation for sale. So there's a sort of a 3-year strategy implementation process, a 2-year monitoring to make sure it's all working properly and continues to run. And then there's the reverse due diligence. Before they sell the thing, are we ready for whoever buys it next, whether it's an IPO or another PE fund or a trade sale? When they come in and they look at it and they kind of run the ruler over all of it, will they say, hey, this is really good? So there's all those kind of things. From a transformational change perspective, it has some interesting characteristics. if you're working for a business that is not PE owned and is going to be owned by its current shareholders or family or whatever it is for a long time, you might make your decision slightly differently, not just on a 3-year to 5-year horizon. But essentially, those are the 5 stages. So what we did was we created a method that managed through those 5 stages. And I think the biggest thing we created was a tool which allows you to do that. And our overall objective was to reduce our costs of delivering it, shift the balance of time from being 50% trying to gather data about it, for example, in due diligence, and 50% analysing the data, to one where it was 10% of the effort was getting the data and 90% was adding the value of analysis. So it was about reducing cost of sale, reducing cost of execution, and putting the effort and the money in the right places. So we built a tool that managed this, and it changed the way we did the assignments. What it did was shift onto the target company a lot of the work of gathering the data. So the tool, they're provided with access. It manages the data they're uploading. It creates the data in a form that we can then ingest into, and I'm going to use the word AI, and I'll try not to use it again in the conversation because it's a bit hackneyed, but to take a different way of looking at the data we're gathering in order to add value very, very straightforwardly. And actually, a lot of the AI tools now are pretty good at that. Mistral and others can do that. But the consequential benefits that we hadn't anticipated were that because we're running it through a tool, and the tool is capable of automating something like 70% of the report at the end of due diligence. And it produces, a 100-page PDF that can be consumed then by the private equity people. What we hadn't anticipated was, particularly if you take technology as an example, the private equity people are by and large really clever financiers who come from McKinsey's and corporate merchant banks and those kind of things. And technology reports tend not to be the most exciting thing they look at on a daily basis. And I think if you do it in a manual way, each report is probably slightly differently shaped and structured and laid out, and the measures are different. What we were doing with the tool, by a consequence of how we were doing it, was they understood what the shape of the report meant. They knew when we had a section that was called CapEx Forecast for Technology, precisely how it is laid out, what would be in it, and why it would be needed. So we actually made consumption of the output easier as well. And so I think, one of my comments earlier about transformation was it leads not just to make state A to state B, but it changes the way you do things, it changes the way you work. And this was a substantial change in the way we work and what we do. So those are the 5 stages. And then the due diligence obviously is the reverse of the one we set up. So we run it on ourselves to say, are we ready? Where are the things missing? What should we do? The danger of this is it becomes too mechanistic. You're turning the handle on a sausage machine, and as long as sausage is coming out, you say they're okay. So we'll never lose the human touch. We put some data through one of the AI tools and said, what are the problems with this company? And actually, it was surprisingly good. It came back with things like there's too much knowledge in a small number of people at the top of the company. And the kind of things we would, I hope, come to ourselves. But nevertheless, you can't just take the output of a method or a tool, or indeed an AI, and then say that works. You have to do that. But the focus then went from us spending effort trying to trawl through documents and upload them and do all that kind of stuff, to the client doing that, the target doing that, and us trying to add the value of looking through the outputs and making sure that they made sort of coherent sense.
Right. It's interesting though that when you're saying about that sort of, I think, second or third stage, where you were saying, okay, you've got the data, you've done your interpretation, but then it's looking across the organisation, across all of the functions of that organisation, to align the activities that you need to do to achieve that North Star. And that's almost exactly the language I'm using within the transformation leaders' body of knowledge, of really defining what a transformation should look like, because it is creating that North Star, but then understanding the impact it's going to have on all of the functions of the business, and then prioritising those activities in a structured, cohesive way to deliver that North Star. And I know you were saying that private equity, that sort of 5-year process of private equity, where a lot of the work needs to be completed in the first 3 years so that they can maximise value in the fourth year and fifth year. But organisations generally can learn from that by putting some type of time scale on, putting some type of pressure into it, putting some type of upcoming, burning platform, because that gives that momentum, doesn't it, and maintains that momentum going forward, which is, in a multi-year program, is absolutely essential.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Things genuinely are different these days. If you 10, 15, 20 years ago, the strategic planning horizon would be 5 to 10 years. And you could be sufficiently confident that your assumptions for the future are probably right, and then you plan on that basis. I remember when I went to work for Deutsche Bahn, and we were doing technology, and they wanted in the proposals into the investment committee. They wanted a 30-year model, and even a 3-year model is really challenging. And the reason was they buy locomotives, and a locomotive has an asset with a 30-year life. And so when you're looking at investment plans and return on investment, those kind of things, you tend to look at that period. So 15, 20 years ago, it's a long-winded way of saying, actually, I think horizons are much shorter now. I think people who say they can be confident about what their strategy should be 3 years out are actually few and far between, and most people are working on a shorter horizon. Now, clearly, there are some industries where that's not true, but in general, and particularly when you're looking at technology, it is a shorter horizon than that. Things come out of left field and offer real opportunity that you'd never considered. So, agility as part of change, we'll probably come on to this as well, is an absolutely essential component. It's not about a plan; it's about delivering an outcome, and therefore you need that balance between line 17 on the Gantt says I'll do this next week, and actually what you need to do to deliver the outcome. And I think one of the things that I hope we don't go through this without talking about is communication, because agility requires communication, and communication is based on everybody understanding what the end objective is. And when you talk about resistance to change, mostly it's because people don't understand the implications of what they're doing, or have a fear of the implications of what they're doing. And that can be addressed by clarity of the North Star and communicating what you're doing and why you're doing it. And this is where the non-engineer in me comes out. I'm an engineer and I like nuts and bolts, and communication, that's for sort of other people. Actually, no, it's for all of us. So yeah, my long-winded way of saying, I think planning horizons are much shorter and strategy horizons are much shorter, but nevertheless, the principles remain true.
Yeah, but I think also I totally agree with you that organisations need to maintain agility and flexibility in the process of getting to where they want to get to, be that North Star or whatever they want to call it. But that's, from a strategic perspective, I think in a lot of cases, there's the vast majority of things won't change, and getting clarity about what's not going to change is just as important as what's going to change, if that makes sense. Because and I've done work in social housing. The thing in social housing that's not going to change is that people will want a nice home to live in. So you can then, that's your strategy, isn't it? That's your number one priority of your strategy. But then you have to be quite agile and take advantage of opportunities that are going to help you deliver better homes for people. And I think a lot of organisations jump around with strategy by looking at the next shiny object, and how does that fit into our place, and forget about the stuff that's just not going to change. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that, especially for those fast-growing businesses that probably you'll see a lot in private equity, or the private equity-backed businesses, shall I say.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on there. I think I guess the issue is tooling and technology and models and that allow us to model all sorts of variations, and therefore it becomes sort of an intellectual challenge. Then, well, what if, and changes. I think you're right. There is a skill in determining what are the variables that you might need to respond to in an agile way, and which of those you need to fix and say that's going to be a core part of what we do. I mean, it's interesting. One of the private equity portfolio companies we did work for was a funeral business, and there are some things in life and death that don't change. But this private equity firm was wanting to buy up a large number of small family-owned funeral businesses and stitch them together into a mega business that would have greater economies of scale and global marketing, national marketing propositions and all those kind of things in competition with one or two big suppliers. And you start to think about all the things you could do to change the way funerals work. But you're right, when it comes down to it and you meet a family who's bereaved and you start to ask, well, what do they actually want? It's relatively simple. It doesn't change. And, e-funerals, as they were calling them, was, I'm not sure they'll ever catch on. But, so you're right. There are some things, a bit like your social hazard, there are some things that don't change. And I think as part of the North Star definition, it's determining what is it that you're actually trying to do here. And that's the key part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just coming back to as you said, typically you'll have a 2 to 3 year horizon to deliver that value within the organisation, the private equity organisations, and probably slightly longer in some of the bigger transformations you've been involved in. What types of things have you done to maintain that momentum and to avoid people going through that change fatigue process that typically you see when you're on multi-year programs?
I think I've not found a single secret sauce that allows that to be the case. I think what I would say is that, and this is, I'm in danger of being contradictory here. I think what I would say is even transformational change under the transformational definition we talked about is made up of lots of small changes. And it, by definition, it probably means that it's complex, it's detailed. And I think to keep momentum up, the plan needs to define regular wins and then regular communication associated with those wins. So provided you can align, here's what we're trying to achieve, this is an unwavering definition of the North Star. Here's a set of wins that we need to have in place to deliver that. And a win a month or a win a week would be great. And here's the communication that goes with them. And I think, because back to the non-engineering me, I think the bottom line is momentum is gained by people feeling they're part of the journey and feeling that they are not necessarily in control of, but aligned to the outcomes and objectives that are being built. And people require constant reminder, both of the objective, the journey, and the value of the role they're playing. You see some transformational change people who bring in the pizza every Thursday afternoon to motivate. And to a certain extent, that does motivate. But I think that's more gloss, probably necessary gloss. But what people really want to know is, am I aligned to the outcome? Am I contributing to it? And will my contribution be recognised? Yeah. And so I think you keep needing to ask yourself those three questions when dealing with the people in this. And actually, when you talk about motivation and keeping going, it's essentially a people thing. There are other things. There's the stakeholders. I wouldn't for a moment say financiers aren't people, but there are stakeholders who are providing the funding and those kind of things. And actually, they need to continue to be motivated and engaged too. But typically, those executing the transformational change or having the change executed on, which is probably the wrong phrase, then the motivation comes from alignment to the target, recognizing that their contribution and having that contribution valued.
So what would you say is the most challenging aspect of leading change and transformation programs, both within a private equity environment and within the larger organisations you've worked with? And is there any difference? Have you noticed any difference between the two?
I'll come on to the differences because I think there are some differences. It may be differences of emphasis rather than actual, but nevertheless there are. I think the problem is that the human beings tend to want want to focus on those things that they are directly in control of. I can modify this, but I can't modify that, so I'm not going to be interested in it. And we naturally, I think, tend towards silo behaviors. And when it's and I call it a management team, there's all sorts of different words for it. The management team that's running the transformation, they can quickly disintegrate into, well, I'm doing the technology piece, I'm doing the people engagement piece, I'm doing the operational change piece. I think one of the big challenges is, how do you keep the leadership team together, motivated, focusing on the same thing, and recognizing that success for one requires success for all, and success for all includes success for one. So just because I'm doing this piece, if Fred over here or Mary there is struggling, then I need to help. And we need to join the dots across. So I think there's a people thing at the leadership end, where I would say that I think he differs from more traditional businesses and longer-term horizons, is that when you go into a PE-owned change, that from day one, that change is what's driving value. You're not just running a business. And so people's willingness to assimilate change, to accept change, appears much, much higher. And therefore you can, I was going to say get away with, that's wrong. You can do things that in a more traditional environment would probably break stuff. Whereas in PE, people going into it, doing it, recognize that's part of the way of life, and therefore you accept more of it. PE, the management team in most structures know that they're only as good as the last year's performance. Whereas if you're in a family-run business, you're there because genetically it's yours. And, that's a very different mindset.
Absolutely, and brings its own challenges. Just going back again, something you touched on earlier in your when you were describing your experience and your background and your career to date, you emphasised the need to consider cultural transformation and how important that was for ultimate success. Do you want to just explain a little bit more about what you mean by cultural transformation?
Yeah, again, it's another word, one of those words which can be interpreted a million different ways. For me, it's about how, well, there's individual culture and there's organizational culture. It's about how you address a problem. What's the style? What's the way you come at it? It's interesting. I won't name it, but I was working in a business where cultural change was a key target for the new CEO. And by cultural change, I think he meant reducing what felt like a civil service mentality where, this is my job and we've always done it this way, to one of risk-taking, innovation, greater reward. And what he discovered was that you can change a lot of the people, but actually somehow the culture stays there. It's as if it's seeped into the walls and it comes back at you. So for me, it's more about a mindset of how you tackle activities, challenges, problems than any particular set of tooling or method or anything you use. And it's about being open, but also recognizing that there is a need to take risk, provided but not gambles. So understanding what you do. So I'm not describing this very well, but you can sense the culture of an organization without really seeing the things it does. You can go into a meeting, if you're parachuted into the board or into an exec meeting or into a steering group, you can sense very quickly the way the organization works. And I guess we've all seen the video of Jeff Bezos saying how he runs meetings in Amazon. And I always think, that's interesting. It's a real cultural indicator of how they tackle things. And every organization ends up with its own culture. I guess what I'd say is I don't think there's a right and wrong for culture. There's a what works to deliver change in a cost-effective, pacey way. And for some organizations, sectors, market segments, functions, it may well be different. But the thing about, I think, cultural change is that you do need a culture. And it's a way of working and an approach and a mindset that the team buys into, rather than what you do. Again, the CEO I referred to earlier, initial approach was to say, this is our target culture, so we're now going to move to that. And my view was, I don't know how you do that, because to me, the culture is the consequence of the way you behave, and that behavior starts at the top. So you have to constantly challenge your colleagues and question yourself to say, am I behaving in a way that's consistent with what we want to be? And in many cases, that's not true. But I think one of the roles of the transformational change leader is to hold all levels of the organization to account, including the CEO and chairman, and say, the way you behaved there, in a very constructive and positive way, is it consistent with what we're trying to deliver and build and be? And I think most people react relatively well on that conversation one-to-one. I mean, do it in front of the rest of the board, you probably don't last long. But I think one-to-one, most people do tend to respond to that sensibly. So is there a simple single answer for what is culture? Again, I probably have to go back to ChatGPT, and I'm sure it'll get it wrong. But no, there isn't. But it's about consistency and alignment of behaviour to the objectives you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely, and that, you make a critical point there, that a key role of the transformation leader is to hold people to account. Are they supporting what we're trying to do, and supporting it in the way that we're trying to do it to get to that North Star? Final question, because I've just noticed the time, or two questions, should I say. Following on from that cultural side, just going back to your earlier career where you were working, I think you said one part in Germany, one part in Holland or Netherlands, in more of a sort of international role or a global role. How did you feel there was any difference in the cultures across boundaries or across geographical areas? Is that and did you see that as an added complexity, or did you not come across that type of complexity?
No, I did, and it is an added complexity. I was smiling because the Dutch, we tend to think of Europeans as being kind of one amorphous mass, and they all work in the same way. I learned the hard way that's absolutely not true. The Dutch are very different to the British, who are very different to the Germans. And just to use an example, I found initially working with the Dutch really quite difficult because they are so direct, to the point where you think they're just rude. But in fact, I spoke to a Dutch colleague and said, I've been here 3 weeks, and forgive me, but this is what it feels like. He said, we have a saying in the Netherlands, which is, the British are too polite to be honest, and the Dutch are too honest to be polite. And I think that's absolutely true. And once you understand the mindset and recognise that a comment which might be something along the lines of "you're completely wrong," that isn't intended to be rude. It's an individual saying, "I have a different view, and I'd like to explain my view to you," which is constructive and sensible. The Germans, I absolutely loved working for the Germans. They, a state-owned railway, you'd think in Germany, was probably some characteristics that you might like. In practice, they're extraordinarily polite. It took 3 years to be on first name terms with many of them because their office culture was to do Mr. This and Mr. That. But the degree of, if you like, integrity with the way they worked, they wouldn't try and dress things up. They'd tell you it as it is. You'd never have an argument in a way that was ad hominem. In other words, not addressing an individual. It would be about what is the thing we're trying to achieve. So I learned an awful lot, both from working with the Dutch and the Germans. I went to university in France, and that's another culture that's entirely different. Fueled by Calvados and red wine, so that's quite different. But I think I learned a huge amount. And in hindsight, when I went over to Germany to work, I was pretty naive. I worked largely in an Anglo-American environment, and ours are fairly similar. Perhaps the Americans sell things they haven't yet built, and we sell things we have built. But nevertheless, the rest of it is pretty similar. So I think the Dutch and the Germans added an enormous dimension to my understanding of managing people. And I'm sure we'll come back to it in the closing remarks, but transformational change management is as much about managing people as it is anything else. And I learned a lot from that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. We always finish with one question, which is, what's your one takeaway that you feel is a must for transformation success?
It's probably the converse of what I said earlier. So, I said that all change, particularly large, complex transformational change, is made up of lots of little changes. And whilst I think that's true, the one thing I think that's important is that you don't let the little changes swamp the big picture. So I guess I'm in danger of answering it with three things rather than one, but set a North Star and communicate. Identify stakeholders and communicate. And I think test every decision and every action against the big North Star that you've got. So it's about never assuming that people understand what the end objective is. Remind them to the point of almost boredom, because that communication is what brings everyone with you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Guy. That was a fascinating conversation. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way of contacting you?
You'll find me on LinkedIn as Guy R. Mason.
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.
Guy, thank you so much for your time today. A great discussion that covers so many interesting elements, especially the need to consider culture in ensuring transformation success. Thank you for listening to this podcast. We're always interested in hearing from you. What do you find useful from this pod? What would you like us to explore more in the future? Please do press the subscribe button. It helps us to reach more people and share the experience of all my guests. Until next time, lead with empathy, inspire with vision, and transform with courage.